Well, good afternoon, friends. I'm Joe Chuman, and I want to welcome you to the Puffin Cultural Forum and our ongoing series of interviews with noted writers. And this afternoon, I'm very pleased to say that we have a very erudite writer who, in effect, is going to discuss something that is really up to the moment and affects our political culture as well as certainly our economic culture in ways that are extremely important. Before I introduce our guest this afternoon, let me briefly introduce myself. Again, I'm Joe Chuman. I'm a leader at the New York Society for Ethical Culture. I also recently retired from the Academy for over 20 years. I was a professor of human rights, teaching the graduate program at Columbia University, also working with undergraduates at Hunter College, and I've taught for the United Nations at its University for Peace in Costa Rica and assorted colleges and universities in the New York metropolitan area. Our guest this afternoon is a Professor David Roediger, who teaches American Studies, History, and African American Studies at the University of Kansas. He's written quite a few books, co-authored others, and many articles. Among his books are How Race Survived United States History and Class, Race, and Marxism. As noted, he's written several tomes, and he focuses his academic interests on issues of race and class. This afternoon, we'll be interviewing David Roediger on his most recent book, The Sinking Middle Class, subtitled A Political History of Debt, Misery, and the Drift to the Right. That subtitle tells us, I think, a great deal about your thesis. Let me just say, what I admired most about this book, and it's a short book, is the extraordinary amount of scholarship that went into it. I mean, the research and the citations that you provide are, in effect, most of them unknown to me, I must admit, are really quite overwhelming. It's a magisterial, short but magisterial work in that regard, and I want to commend you for it. It's also something that presents a thesis that I should say is somewhat, unless one is schooled in economics, particularly leftist economics, it's something that is not immediately obvious. And I think I want to spend the afternoon unpacking your thesis and some of the ideas, but I want to start with definition. Okay, Socrates said all philosophy begins with definition. Maybe economic analysis does as well. You talk a mainstay, David, of your treatise, of course, deals with class, and the term middle class, working class, and white working class are basically foundational to the book. I'd like you to try, and these are terms that clearly, as you point out, have changed their meaning through time and also are employed differently depending on the political perspectives, political interests, and the political actors who are implying those terms. So could you perhaps, as briefly as possible, define middle class? What does middle class mean? What does it entail? What does working class mean? And what does white working class mean and its significance?
Thank you, and thank you so much for having me. This is a
Sure.
book that came out in 2020 with OR Books, which is designed to kind of create a buzz around a book and then to sell it to another publisher. So the second publisher in 2022 was Haymarket,
Right.
and it is a little bit different in that incarnation, but both are things that I only a little remember. So I will definitely try, but I'm at work on something very, very completely different
Uh-huh.
now. So I think that you really hit on the key question, and that's the definition of middle class. And it's a very difficult one. The greatest book on the middle class was by somebody who was sometime like you at Columbia, C. Wright Mills.
Mm-hmm.
The great sociologist Mills wrote a book called White Collar, but the subtitle signals that it's about the middle class. And you read the whole book, pretty long book, and you get to the last chapter, and Mills says, well, of course, there's no such thing as the middle class. There are only middle classes. And what he means is that he was enough of a materialist, a Marxist, to say these people that we're calling middle class exist in all kinds of economic relationships and all kinds of relations to people who own things and people who manage their labor. And so, you know, somebody could be middle class for a lot of different reasons. So there's that problem. There's the other problem that you mentioned, that the middle class shifts in meaning over time. So middle class might mean in 1600s, in the middle between the nobility, the aristocracy, and the commoners, and that would be the bourgeoisie. And so there's a lot of confusion. Sometimes the word bourgeois gets translated as middle
Yes.
class.
Mm-hmm.
By the 19th century, which is mostly what I have studied through the years, middle class starts to mean the people who are in the middle of the large capitalist firms and the people who have been reduced to working for wages. So they still own a farm. They there may be free professionals like lawyers. They might own a workshop. They're the middle class. And their hallmark is that they're independent. They're supposedly independent and independent minded.
Mm-hmm.
And then in our period, middle class means tons of different things. It often defined by taste or dress, white collar versus blue collar, or by education, or by income, or some combination of all of those things. And just to put a cap on it, middle class, sometimes middle class is something that a social scientist tells you that you are. And sometimes it's something that you're invited to choose being. So when we see
Uh-huh.
surveys that say 90% of the United States identifies as middle class, that's asking people, and we
Right.
don't see those anymore, but we used to see them sometimes. That's asking people what class are really. Often the way it was phrased is, aren't you middle class? And people would say, yeah, I'm middle class. And that was a voluntary description of what
Right.
the was. But you could also say, the sociologist, know you're middle class if you have X, Y, and Z characteristics. So a lot of confusion and a lot of difference from working class, where we can at least say there are two sides to that relationship, and one side owns things and the other side has to go to work for those who owns things on a kind of everyday basis. So I think it's a particularly slippery um,
Concept. Yeah, I have it. Well, maybe it's jumping the gun a little bit, but I'm wondering if you can summarize your thesis in the book. As a broad statement, you employ the notion that the appeal to a middle class life is in a sense a mistake, and if not, in effect, a fraud perpetrated by political operatives, those who have an interest in promoting that delusion, as well as the culture at large. I mean, this is a book of criticism, and I'm wondering if you could sort of elaborate on that idea, and we'll pick it apart, and and so forth as we go along. But if you could
okay.
just sort of generally state your thesis as to what is problematic about the appeal to the middle class in American culture, American life, as delivered by politicos, as well as perhaps the culture at large.
Yeah, we can talk more later about whether the United States is or isn't a middle class nation historically. But in the period that you're talking about, the kind of recent past, one of the things that shocked me in doing the research is that the word middle class hardly comes up in the United States until the 1920s.
Uh-huh.
In the
Uh-huh.
1800s, when people talked about the middle class in print, they usually were fascinated with the European middle classes, and there'd be articles like the Belgian middle class or
Uh-huh.
the Polish middle class in the US press. But the United States didn't describe itself and its citizens until the 1920s as a middle class place. So what happens, and why is it that in the 20s, and then particularly in the 30s and the 50s, you really get lots and lots of people wanting to say that they're middle class, are wanting to say that the nation is middle class. And I think what happens is labor revolts and working class struggles and the Russian Revolution and all of these things that call the stability of capitalist state into question. And so you get people more and more tempted to say, but the United States has a strong middle class, which is a bulwark. against that. So in the 1920s, the famous book by Robert Lind and Helen Lind, Middletown, the kind of originary work of sociology of the city, the small city, they actively resist using the term middle class. They said middle class doesn't have any application for us. But in the 30s, when they come back to Middletown Revisited, they say, maybe there is. Everybody's using this new term, middle class. It's a new thing. In the 50s, the middle class becomes a product of the Cold War. And so you said this is tied to interests and politics. Well, it's very much tied to the interest of the United States as being able to say, we're not a nation that reduces those at the bottom to sameness, but a place of consumer choice and a place of suburbs. And the main debate in the Cold War between Khrushchev and Nixon is in a kitchen, in an American middle class kitchen, demonstration kitchen. Right. So the Cold War becomes a time when it's patriotic and anti-communist to say that you're middle, to emphasize that you're middle class. But all of that said, and the skyrocketing of the use in academics and the press of middle class in the 50s and 60s, it's really not until the 1990s that we begin to have politicians use the term middle class. And this was shocking to me because, I had already forgotten all those other elections that when it was never mentioned. And when people talked about class in US politics, when Lyndon Johnson talked about class, 90% of the time he was talking about the poor. But by the time you get to the 90s and the Clinton election, everybody is vying to be the candidate of the middle class.
Yes, and the poor never enter into political discourse. They're to be feared. They're to be feared, right? They're invisible, in effect, right? No, I remember that certainly well in the last several election cycles. That's been the case. Clearly, David, from your point of view, the middle class is a problematic concept, and I guess one that I have to think self-reflectively about, because it basically informs my identity and my understanding of my own personal trajectory in life. I was born after World War II, as you were, and basically the presumption is that was the time of the Eisenhower years, though conservative, was the flourishing of the middle class, and that the labor movement had built the middle class, and that American economy was expanding, at least if you were white, was expanding tremendously after that period, and I was the happy product of it. I mean, I must admit, I would say to myself when I went to college in the 1960s, I ensured that I never took a course that had any practical application whatsoever, because that's not what college was for, and that the economy would take care of me. And I must admit, now that I'm in my retirement, it has taken care of me. I mean, I really don't have, regardless of the miseries of life, and we'll get to those in middle class life and teaching in academia and so forth. Economically, I can't have too many complaints in that regard. And a term you don't use in the book, doesn't come up, is the American dream. And I associate the American dream with middle class aspiration, right? And I can look at my own family. My father was born in 1903 in a shtetl, a poor Yiddish-speaking Jewish community in Ukraine. He was a witness to Tsarist pogroms, and my father would say with a little bit of pride that he had absolutely no education, formal education whatsoever, that he was therefore a self-made man. He emigrated to Cuba, I think in the 1920s, and became a successful haberdasher. I have a photograph of my dad in Casa Lázaro, his name was Lazar, in his haberdashery store where he was very successful. And when he came to the States and married my mom, I remember as a child, he said, Joe, a man will be judged by his hat, his tie, and his shoes. Okay, we're talking about middle class bourgeois sensibilities, right? This informs my life. I'm a product of the New Left of the 1960s, and therefore I made sure that I never wore a hat, never wore a tie, and my shoes were never polished, right? And that still seems to be the case. I haven't outgrown that. All I'm talking about is that from a subjective, you mentioned how people identify themselves as being part of the definition, as from the point of view of subjectivity, it clearly being middle class was something that drove my father, the immigrant, out of poverty into his aspirations as an American. Okay, so in that sense, it's deeply embedded in his identity, and I must say, in the aftermath, my own identity. I'm a product. I live in the afterglow of that immigrant, upwardly bound immigrant experience. So that the middle class has that resonance to me. I mean, there are negative resonance in terms of bourgeois and so on and so forth, but it was a driver, okay,
Right.
subjectively. Just talk, I can't help but, bring my own personal experience into it. So here I
Yeah,
am, you know.
I think that's a very important American story. Uh, I think timing is important. For one thing, that immigrant story becomes impossible with immigration restriction after, or much less possible after 1924 and
Yeah.
through the 1960s. But also the period of your life and my life was what Time Life called the American century. It really only lasted maybe 35 years, but it was this boom time when the U.S. in the post-war world, dominated the political economy of the world and actually functioned as a hegemonic power. My parents, all working class family, kind of skilled workers in quarries and railroads. And then my mother got 2 years of education to become a grade school teacher. That's all which needed at that time in the 1940s, and became middle class. But then later in her life became a trade union militant and wouldn't have thought of
Mhm.
herself as middle class, or at least in no easy way thought of herself as middle class. My dad went to work in the same quarry that his family had always worked in, but not in the quarrying part, in the office. And, wore a white collar and shiny shoes and did all the things you're talking about. Very much, I think, thought of himself as participating in an American dream. They got a house on GI Bill, but was much more miserable and made less money than his
Mhm. Mhm.
brothers who stayed in the skilled trades. And
Right.
so I think we run into all sorts of complexities. And in the world, we run into all sorts of complexities. If we look at the United States in terms of its ranking in the world in wealth, uh, and we just add up everybody's wealth and divide by the number of people, so kind of a mean. The United States is third in the world, but it's really first. The two that are ahead are anomalous and small countries. It's the dominant economic power if you
Yes.
calculate things that way. If you look at it in terms of the median, the middle,
Yes.
in one way, exactly the middle. The United States is about 18th or 21st in the world in
Yes.
terms of wealth. So in that sense, too, it's not a middle class nation in what it delivers necessarily. In fact, it's
Right.
behind a lot of nations where healthcare is provided and education
Sure.
is
Sure.
still mostly paid for. So, I think as we get beyond the 50s and 60s, and maybe the 70s, that becomes more complicated, the connection of American prosperity and the middle class.
Okay, I have to, I can't get beyond this. What caught my attention was in the beginning, you talk about your university teaching, and as mentioned, I taught for over 20 years in the university as well. And you defined your work in the university as working class, which again, invokes the question of definition. You also define, I couldn't get past this, David, you defined your experience in the university teaching as soul killing. Okay, I've taught in the
Mhm.
university. Why was it, from your own experience, soul killing?
Well, not the teaching. I've stayed in it for a long time because I love the teaching, but I think the
Me too. Right.
bureaucratic
Yes.
aspects of it are very deadening. And
Yes.
particularly, I've gone from one Midwestern state university to another for 40 years, Missouri, Minnesota, Illinois, and then Kansas. And these are universities in Illinois and Minnesota are more prosperous, but they're universities that have very dire funding and financial
Right.
problems. And at a place like Kansas or Missouri are kind of more or less closing up shop. and they don't get to hire, they don't get to build initiatives. They're very different from the Ivy League schools in Northwestern, where I've also taught sometime. And in the case of Kansas and Missouri now, they're very much hostage to right-wing state governments that outlaw the things that I'm interested in.
Yeah.
So critical race theory is one of the fields that I've been thinking about this a lot. I have a autobiography, intellectual memoir coming out called The Education of a Critical Race Theorist. And, it's a trip to be in a university that sort of investigates the things that you've given your life to and are studying. So that's a very peculiar one on my part, but that's a dimension of what I'm talking about there.
Well, I want to talk about another dimension, which may not have been part of your experience, but was basically my experience, and that was I was an adjunct throughout my
Mm-hmm.
college teaching career. Now, I did not need to teach for the money. I did it because I love the classroom and I love
Right,
ideas and
right.
so on and so forth. But I pitied those younger people who aspired to be full professors, would become adjuncts, thinking that that would be the stepping stone towards being hired when there would be an opening, only to find that the universities look somewhere else, and so on. And these people ran around the New York metropolitan area, teaching at 3 colleges, working basically impoverished wages, without any benefits, without any security, without any tenure, without any respect, and so on and so forth. That was soul killing, in my view. And I don't
And
think enough work has been done. I mean, universities are huge employers. I don't think enough work has been done on the marginalization and oppression of, and I'll call it oppression, of adjunct professors who I think are abused economically and have their idealism abused. That's one area which I think is truly soul killing,
and now
as I see it. Yeah.
deliver most of the credit hours in our universities, certainly in our state universities, so that this is not uh, marginal experience on the side of the university. It's how the university runs now, and so I think where I teach, maybe only a third of the credit hours are delivered by faculty
Yeah,
of
right.
attending
Absolutely.
the
Yeah. No,
grad class.
I think that needs more exposure. I want to read something that relates to this that caught my eye, if I may. It's in the preface. Here you say it was very dramatic. You say this book comes out of reflection on such bamboozling, particularly um, oh, okay, here. You start off by saying, we who are really working class are bamboozled into middle class self-identification. This seems to be part of the dynamic you're talking about. This book comes out of reflection on such bamboozling, particularly in U.S. politics. However, the work of researching it convinced me that middle class consciousness among working class people is a deeply complex matter rooted in material experiences, including ones of extraordinary misery, as well as in getting fooled by ideologues and advertisers and bribed by petty privileges. I thought that was a powerful statement. I'm wondering if you can expand on that, because I think that, again, goes to the heart of your thesis.
Yeah, the stuff about the advertisers and the being fooled and the politicians and being fooled, I think that's a little bit old stuff. And in fact, in the Cold War, there were very great muckraking sociology books about the middle class and its
Hmm.
conformity and its consumption and all of that. What I think is new in this book is that there's a way in which the middle class is miserable before it falls. We think about sinking, we think about failing, we think about the middle class in crisis, but there's a set of
Oh,
things that adhere to middle class life, and one of them is debt. The
oh,
middle class has always had a lot more access to credit and a lot more debt, and has ended up in debt for houses, ended up in debt for cars, ended up in debt for education to a particularly alarming extent. So, certainly working class people and poor people have debt too, but middle class people have a particular level and problem
yeah,
with debt. Being bossed at work in terms of one's personality. I think, is a particularly middle class misery, if we kind of, if you will, an office work misery. If we go back to Bartleby Melville's great short story about the office worker, Bartleby the scrivener, already then he was seeing that this was a particular kind of work. This was the work my dad did 15 feet away from the owner of the quarry. And, you know, and so you were judged on your dress, you were judged on your smile, you were judged on your personality, on now the big word in evaluations is team playerness. You're judged on your team playerness. Well, that's come into manual labor evaluations a little bit, but mostly through history. The blue collar worker was judged by whether he could keep up with the assembly line, or whether, if you were Schmidt in example of scientific management, whether he could lift 47 tons of pig iron a day or he couldn't lift it. That was how you knew if you were doing a good job. So this idea that there, what Mills called personality salesmanship, is something that I think is a particularly middle class misery. So I think that if you work in an office, white collar, not white collar, pink collar, not pink collar, you are a working class person, whether you're salaried or you're waged. But I understand why a lot of those people, at least situationally, say this debt problem that I have, this problem with my boss sitting in judgment of my personality, that's a middle class. That I see that as a middle class problem. I can see why people would see it that way.
Yeah, I want to pick up on the question of debt and personal finances. And again, if I can wax a little bit autobiographical, I married a woman with 6 children who was a bit older than I, and I raised them. And this was they went to college in the 1980s. And I had 6 children. They were virtually just about 6 years apart, so there was not much difference. And at the time, as now, I was a clergy person, not making a large wage, and my wife was a social worker who worked with the poor, not making a large wage. And at that time, we were able, with a great deal of effort and borrowing and so forth, we were able to send 5 kids to college, 3 of them to private schools, 1 to medical school, 1 to law school, and 1 got a doctorate, okay, in social psychology. Today, we could not do that. The times have changed. And when I look at it, David, there are certain fixed costs that middle class people now have to contend with that make the circumstance different from what it was even 30 years ago. And I define those as increased costs of medical care, the extraordinary cost of child care. If you're a two-parent working family and you have to have your kids watched after school, it's very expensive. As we all know, college tuition is unaffordable. I mean, there's got to be a new model. It is so expensive. And then, of course, housing has gone up. It used to be a third of your income, and now it's closer to half. So if you look at those fixed costs that assault the working class and the middle class, you can understand the extraordinary indebtedness people have and the type of anxiety that produces. I'm wondering and one other thing, I want to move to this. You do mention it. It's often said that 40% of Americans have less than $400 in discretionary money in savings. Is that true? Okay, I hear that often said. And B, how in the world did those people survive? That is not, if we talk about the strength of the economy, that doesn't indicate a strong economy to me. If 40% have fewer than $400 in savings, my goodness, that's a crisis. I'm
Yeah,
wondering if you can talk about those things as related to indebtedness and the anxieties that oppress the middle class.
yeah. Well, I'm in California this year. I'm at the Huntington Library on a research fellowship, and I participated a little bit in the Cal State LA teacher strike.
Hmm.
And there were a number of people who talked on those picket lines about coming to California, trying to get a job in the Cal State system, initially as a lecturer, and then move into a more permanent job, and living in their cars.
Yes,
Because,
yes,
I mean,
yes,
so it's not
yes.
just people who are unhoused through absolute poverty or joblessness, there are a lot of people, and a lot of people, kind of in between, buying either a nice car or a van that they make into a home. But there's this kind of, and nurses as well, and traveling nurses, that it's so lucrative to work in California, but so expensive to live in California,
Yes.
that you end up with these people who are in very, very, the sociologist Eric Olin called these contradictory class locations. So these are people sometimes at Cal State LA, sometimes with PhDs, sometimes with MFAs, who are, their salary's not terrible, but they're homeless.
Yes.
They're unhoused. And so, I think we see these contradictions. When I started to write this book in about 2017, say, one of the hallmarks that the St. Louis Federal Reserve does the best research on the middle class and standards of life. And one of the things that they assumed was that a middle class family got a new car every few years. And then it became clear that a used car every few years. And now there's a crisis in used car prices that they've so gone through the roof that,
Yes.
or you have people who bought an RV in 2008. They were retiring. They had this life planned out for themselves. It turned out that the housing market collapsed, and now they go around and park on Walmart parking lots. There's a good little film about this, and work at Amazon centers, and kind of are touring but elderly, working class. But they had and have some resources. So I think that it's these contradictory locations that are really interesting. Another one that I see all the time in the Midwest is people who went from a good auto work or steelworking job, and maybe they were making $40 an hour as union workers. Deindustrialization happened. Now they work at Lowe's or Home Depot, and they make $16 an
I
hour,
know.
but they're managers. They're called the night shift manager. And so,
Well, are they working class or middle class? How would
yeah,
they
well,
define themselves, right?
that's the thing. Well, they didn't think that they experienced class mobility by going from $40 an hour to 16. But the way that we sometimes imperfectly measure these things might capture them as having actually moved up.
Right, even though they've moved down
Right,
materially. Right.
right.
Yeah, no, I understand that. A lot of it is window dressing, right? And sort of creating new aspirations. Okay, one question that I have that in terms of defining oneself as middle class is a term you don't use, but seems to uh, that I would invoke is the question of personal autonomy. To some
Mhm.
extent, you seem to hover around the issue that being middle class involves, as opposed to working class, involves autonomy. And you do say that at one time, in the 19th century especially, there was a class of entrepreneurs, right? And you do define those, seem to define those as middle class. But today, of course, everybody, almost everyone, there are independent workers. We have a gig economy now and so forth. But that most people seem to work for someone else. Even if they're working in upper echelons, they still have a boss looking over them. They still have a tight bureaucratic structure that they have to basically respond to and answer to, and so on and so forth. How does the issue of personal autonomy figure into your definition or understanding of class, working class, middle class, and so forth?
Well, I think autonomy is important. I think about this in my own situation. For the longest time, I made about the same money or less than my friends who went to the auto plants out of high school or became
Right.
telephone workers until I was probably 50. That was the case, and they had a big head start, and a lot of them are retired now, and they did harder work also, and they were very closely bossed, although they'd often figure out ways to get around that as well. So university work is autonomous, often in the sense that you have some say over what classes you
Right.
teach. I would have only very, very seldom been observed teaching. You're
Right.
not managed in that sense. I had a group in the 1990s of young women who were wanted to do gay and lesbian history at University of Minnesota and wanted me to be their advisor. And I didn't know anything about it, the field that would enable me to do it. But for 2 years, I just gave seminars in which they taught me gay and lesbian, tremendous opportunity in terms of autonomy. I'm doing this right now with an Alaskan student who I'm supervising. I don't know anything about Alaska. So 1 week we read a book on Alaska that she introduces, and then the next week we read something else. So these moments of autonomy are, I think, very compelling and seductive inside university settings, but it's increasingly only for that select tenured group that can contemplate doing that. And now I think about it 3 and 4 times and say, you know, this university has record numbers of students and record low, and it's cut its payroll in half in the last 10 years. How much longer can anybody afford to be setting an example of self-exploitation like this? So the way this comes up in the literature is Michael Zweig, who teaches at Stony Brook, very great scholar of the working class. He, until very recently, and he wants to argue that there's a working class majority in the United States. He's not somebody who wants to say there's a big middle class. But until very recently, he had teachers and nurses as middle class people in the United States, because not so much because of their education, but he regarded them as having a certain amount of autonomy, even K through 12 teachers as having more autonomy than if you worked at McDonald's, say.
Yeah, well, more than a McDonald's, but I think a lot of teachers today would complain that their autonomy has been crimped significantly.
Yeah. And finally, in the last version of his book, he says, "I'm now convinced that nurses and teachers, not only nurses and teachers, working class, I think, but they're kind of the leading edge of militancy in the working class now. It's the strikes of teachers, including non-unionized teachers that didn't even have a union, and nurses that have really kind of set the pace for the renewal of the labor movement. So, you know, I mean, another one to think about in that connection might be Starbucks workers. Starbucks is such a middle class place. And I think a lot of its workers find their ways from being customers and, you know, participating in this sort of middle class milieu. But they're unionizing. They're some of the best trade unionists in the United States, and they're exploited. So, you know, and they realize that. So I think this line is very shifting and interesting between working class and...
No, those are interesting points and exemplary points, I think. Okay, let's talk about, you talk about the rubric of saving the middle class and how that phrase has been employed and exploited by politicians. And you invoke Bill Clinton. And 1992 is sort of the inflection point where the movement to save the middle class was put on the political agenda and in the minds of American voters. Could you talk about that?
Yeah. And here's a place where I actually still study race in this middle class book, because I think this has a lot to do with race and whiteness. So it's not until the 1992 election that we begin to see this emphasis on the middle class as the key constituency. But it becomes the key constituency because it stands in for the white unionized working class. And these are the people who are being referred to as Reagan Democrats, that Reagan Democrats are the people who have been lost to the Democratic Party, and they've supposedly been lost to the Democratic Party because the Democratic Party is too in favor of welfare, too soft on crime, too countenancing of affirmative action. So it's only when Greenberg goes to Macomb County and is hired by the Democratic Party to poll people in that working class county and calls them middle class, titles his book middle class dreams, it's only then that we begin to see middle class rise to the top of US political priorities. Within 20 short years, by the 2012 election between Obama and Romney, they both campaigned on the exact same, I'm the candidate of the middle class. Romney's a kind of improbable one because he's so rich, but he's the candidate of the middle class. Obama's the candidate of the middle class. And they both define the middle class in exactly the same way. If you make less than $250,000 a year, you're middle class. So they're including all of the poor people. This is one reason why poor people get read out of political debates.
Right.
Obama says, well, of course I'm including the poor people. They all want to be middle class. That's his.
Whether they are or not, right?
That's
Yes.
his reason.
Right.
But the watchword becomes, for political wisdom, if you can get the middle class, you can get elected. And now you've constructed a figure for the middle class, $250,000. It includes 90-some% of the US population. So of course you can get elected if you can win that class.
Right. Yeah. No, well, let me clarify though. $250,000 is a lot of money from my point of view. But how does this move we've moved obviously far to the right in terms of American politics. How does the Clinton moment and the appeal to saving the middle class play into the dynamic of moving the political landscape as a whole towards the right?
Yeah, well, I think what happens is that the Clinton program becomes based on this wisdom that's derived from the focus group polls that Greenberg does outside of Detroit, is that you have to not change things for working people, white or black, but you have to listen to the conservative white voter, the Reagan Democrat. And so it means being able to go to black organizations and say, can't ask for too much, because when we ask for too much, the Republicans get elected. And it means going to white organizations, white voters, and saying, we don't have anything for you where NAFTA is concerned. We don't have anything where trade union law is concerned. We can't have those things for you, but we are going to listen to you on ending welfare as we know it. We're going to listen to you on scaling back affirmative action. We're going to have 3 strikes and you're out crime policies. We're going to have doubling or tripling of incarceration. We're going to do those kinds of things, which are accomplished with Republican help, of course, in the second Clinton after the by-elections when Clinton's elected. So I think that it's in that sense that it solves this problem that the Democrats can't get elected because they don't have anything to offer substantively either of their 2 major constituencies, either minoritized voters or trade union working class voters who are still important at that point. But now they have a strategy. They can say to both groups, if you want to get elected, you have to play along with this. And the way it really comes, the person who resists it is Jesse Jackson. And Jesse Jackson does try, not very successfully, to get the unions behind him. And he tries to say that the Rainbow Coalition can produce a politics that's based on actually making demands on behalf of labor and Black America. But he completely gets outfoxed by this Greenberg strategy. There's a moment in the 92 election that I bet you'll remember. It was kind of a vivid moment where Clinton goes to a Jesse Jackson event, and Sister Souljah, the rapper, has been honored at this event. And Clinton picks a fight with Jackson, saying that Sister Souljah's anti-white, and finds some
sure, yeah,
and quotes. And Jackson says a really, really interesting thing after that attack. And he says, I feel like that Clinton was speaking to some people who were not even in the room. and what he meant was he was speaking to those white voters in Macomb County. And he and then it turns out that that visit was proposed by Stanley Greenberg. Greenberg told Clinton, you should go do this. This epitomizes what our strategy can be and how we can make gains without having to move policy very far.
Yeah, quite insidious. Well, in order to bring this to an end, I want to take this concern analysis and bring it up to the moment. It seems as if, and I'm not the only one to feel this way, that democracy is on a precipice. We have this type of outlook with Trump on steroids. It's gone off the deep end. I'm wondering what your economic analysis is, class analysis is at the moment, as we look ahead towards November, when we're in the maw of Trumpism, the insanity of American politics, the destruction of the Republican Party, and we look at Joe Biden, who presents himself as a friend of the working man, and so on and so forth. Where are we in this? What do you make of it? What type of clarity can you bring to this moment?
Well, I think it's the same situation in the sense that that the Democrats can't yet have much in the way of a positive program beyond identification with, friend of, politics, middle-class Joe. I guess now Biden calls himself Amtrak Joe because he rode the train so often. And that's kind of our Scranton Joe. It kind of establishes this middle class / working class affinity.
Right.
But he also represented Delaware for very faithfully for a long time in a very, very corporate state. And so we have this problem, but then we have the immediate problem of Trump. And one of my questions that grows out of this book is, will there be much talk about the middle class in this election? The 2020 election, we didn't have much talk at all because of COVID. We didn't have much debate, and it looks like people might be more interested in not having substantive debates, even though they'd be possible in terms of the pandemic now. So, and some pollsters, some advice that Biden is getting are saying a lot of people have experienced so much downward mobility or so much debt that they don't consider themselves middle class anymore. There are some polls that show, some internal polls that show that the self-identification as middle class is in the 40% now. So maybe that's not the 91% that Romney and Obama could rely on. And maybe we won't hear so much talk about the middle class, which I think, could be a clarifying thing if that takes place. And we'd have to talk more about, well, who actually are we talking about? We're not just talking about everybody and nobody. When we talk about the middle class, we have to, and maybe there'd be some room to talk about working class and union demands. But the other kind of frightening thing is that for the first time in U.S. politics in the last 10 years, we get open talk about the white working class. And that's been from the same people in the Democratic Party who gave us Clinton. Greenberg and others around him have done this study group seminar on the white working class. And I think that's a kind of a dangerous one. The white working class as a term really only existed until 30 years ago among fascists. The White Aryan Nation and others really pushed this idea that there was a specifically white working class. And so, in terms of the content of my book, I think that this election lends itself to thinking about, well, will the middle class be discussed very much? And I think it might not be discussed very much, but I think we might find ourselves wishing that it were discussed more. And we might have to settle for using the term middle class once in a while to fill in for, the aspirations of ordinary people.
Well, I think that the term white, to take your analysis and bring it to its, I think, correct conclusion is that the appeal to the white working class and the alienated white working class and feeling that the white working class is becoming a minority in America even more is the breeding ground for white supremacy and the type of
Yes.
extremism and hatred that we see
Yeah.
in America. It's very, you're right, very frightening in that regard.
Even if
Yeah.
it's not exactly right to say that the white working class is the culprit behind Trumpism. There are plenty of uh, wealthy suburban Trump
Yes,
supporters,
that true.
and we know
Yes.
that. And there are also a seventh of the electorate is people who have college degrees and so get defined as middle class
Mm-hmm.
and low pay, and they're the most left wing part of the U.S. electorate.
Yes.
Talk
Yes.
about the silent, the people that aren't paid attention to,
Right.
but that's a hefty chunk of who we're dealing with in the United States.
Right. Well, before we go, let me ask you, you mentioned at the beginning that you're working on a new book. What is it?
Well, I said it couldn't hardly be more different. I'm working on
Yeah.
Friday's character in Robinson Crusoe. And so how's that?
We're right.
400 years apart. And
Isn't that interesting? Well, what type of profound analysis did you draw out of that
well,
character? Right.
it's not so profound so far. I'm just kind of toying with things. But what interests me is that in the book, it's pretty clear that Friday is an indigenous person, a Carib,
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
not African, not African hair, not African color. Really emphasized a lot. But when I ask audiences now, what about Friday? They think he's black. A
Yeah.
lot of the audience thinks of Friday as black, and so I'm
Uh-huh.
interested in how we got from the novel to these minstrel shows and plays. And Al Jolson has a very famous play of
Uh-huh.
Robinson Crusoe and movies. And so it's a
Uh-huh.
little bit not as far back in the past as it seems, but it starts with the novel itself. And it's very fun.
Well, isn't that interesting? There's just a new book out, I understand, that looks at Jim, the character in Huckleberry Finn, right?
Yeah,
So,
yeah,
right.
yeah.
Your book is part of a wave. Hey, that's great.
Right.
David Roediger, it's really been a pleasure talking to you. This has been a very important and I think intriguing and engaged discussion, and I'm very grateful for it. So keep up your great work.
Thanks
Keep up
very
your
much
great
for
work.
your
Yeah.
wonderful questions.
Yeah,
Thank
okay,
you.
David. Thank you. Be well. And to all of you who've listened in, I wish you a good day. Take care. Bye-bye.